The thermometer hanging outside Benjamin Sorenson's cabin read 43 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. It was February 6, 1882, in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, the coldest night of what would later be called the Winter of Death. Across the scattered settlements, families huddled within arm's reach of their fireplaces, burning wood at desperate rates, watching frost crawl across their interior walls, despite fires that roared hot enough to make the stones glow. In one cabin 3 miles north of Deadwood, a family of 4 slept within 2 feet of their fireplace. The father woke every hour to feed more logs into the flames. The interior temperature of their cabin, measured the next morning, was recorded at 4 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees above zero inside, with a fire burning all night. 2 of their children would develop frostbite on their feet that night from sleeping too far from the flames. But in Benjamin Sorenson's cabin, a single quarter-mile away, Benjamin slept comfortably under a wool blanket in a bed positioned 15 feet from his fireplace. His fire had gone out at 10 o'clock the previous evening. No coals remained. The firebox was cold. Yet when he woke at dawn, the interior temperature of his cabin was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. 51 degrees when it was 43 below outside. A 94-degree difference. And his sleeping area, insulated by the thermal mass of his cabin structure, had maintained an even warmer 54 degrees through the night. His neighbor's cabin, 4 degrees inside. Benjamin's cabin, 51 degrees inside. A 47-degree difference between 2 structures built the same year, from similar materials, by men with comparable skills. The only significant difference was the roof. And what a difference that roof made. Benjamin's roof was not a normal roof. It was not the thin layer of sod over split shingles that most cabins used. It was not even the double-layer sod roof that careful builders employed. Benjamin's roof was 3 feet thick, 3 solid feet of layered materials that neighbors had called ridiculous, wasteful, and just plain stupid. A dirt roof so absurdly over-engineered that people rode from miles away just to see it and laugh. They called it Sorenson's Folly. They said he'd built a roof so heavy it would collapse by Christmas. They wagered on when the weight would cave in the walls. They predicted that, come spring, when all that dirt became saturated with snowmelt, the whole thing would come down on his head. They said a lot of things. Then February 6th came, and while they shivered at 4 degrees, Benjamin slept warm at 51 degrees. And nobody laughed anymore. This is the story of how one man's understanding of heat loss through roofs changed cabin construction across the northern frontier. How a childhood memory of Icelandic turf houses combined with systematic experimentation created the most thermally efficient roof design anyone had seen. And how what looked like 3 feet of stupidity turned out to be 3 feet of genius that could mean the difference between surviving winter and dying in it. Benjamin Sorenson was born in 1849 in Reykjavik, Iceland. His early childhood was spent in a traditional Icelandic turf house, a structure that had evolved over centuries to deal with Iceland's brutal climate. The walls were thick stone and turf, but the roof was the defining feature. Layers upon layers of turf, peat, and birch bark, sometimes reaching 4 or 5 feet thick at the ridge. These roofs were so well insulated that a small fire could heat the entire house, and that heat would remain for hours after the fire went out. Benjamin's family immigrated to America when he was 8 years old, settling first in Wisconsin, then moving to Minnesota. Benjamin grew up in conventional American wood frame houses and log cabins, but he never forgot those Icelandic turf houses. He remembered how warm they stayed with minimal heating, how stable the interior temperature remained, how the thick roof seemed to press down on the house like a warm blanket. In 1878, at age 29, Benjamin filed a homestead claim in Dakota Territory. The Black Hills region was opening up to settlement after the gold rush brought infrastructure and population. Benjamin claimed 160 acres of mixed timber and meadowland, good water, and reasonable access to Deadwood for supplies. He spent his first months cutting and preparing logs for cabin construction. By August of 1878, he was ready to build. The cabin would be 18 feet by 24 feet, log construction with a stone fireplace, standard frontier design in most respects. But Benjamin had plans for the roof, plans that drew on his childhood memories and his own thinking about heat loss, plans that would make his roof completely different from anything his neighbors had ever seen. The first unusual step came when Benjamin built his walls. Most cabins had walls 7 to 8 feet tall. Benjamin built his walls only 6 feet tall. This seemed backwards. Lower ceiling meant less interior space. Why waste logs building wider when you could build taller? Benjamin's reasoning was specific. Lower walls meant a lower roof peak, which meant less total surface area losing heat. Heat rises, and most heat loss in any cabin happens through the roof. Reduce the roof area, reduce the heat loss. But more importantly, lower walls meant the roof structure could support more weight, much more weight. Because Benjamin was planning to build a roof that would weigh approximately 3 tons. The roof framing used logs twice as thick as standard cabin roofs. Benjamin selected straight pine logs 8 inches in diameter and spaced them every 16 inches instead of the typical 24 inches. This created a framework that could support enormous weight. His neighbors, watching this construction, thought he was being wasteful. Why use such heavy logs so closely spaced? It was unnecessary and expensive in both materials and labor. Next came the roof decking. Standard practice was to use split shingles or thin planks. Benjamin used full 2-inch thick planks, carefully fitted with almost no gaps. He covered every square inch of the roof with solid wood decking. This alone was unusual enough to draw comments. All that lumber just for decking? Most of it would be hidden under sod anyway. Why not use thinner, cheaper materials? Then came the vapor barrier. This was the innovation that really puzzled people. Benjamin had acquired several large rolls of canvas, which he'd treated with a mixture of linseed oil and pine tar. He spent days painting this mixture onto the canvas, creating sheets of semi-waterproof fabric. He laid these treated canvas sheets over the entire wood decking, overlapping the seams and sealing them with more tar mixture. His neighbor, a man named Walter Hughes, watched this process with complete bafflement. Hughes rode over one September afternoon and found Benjamin on his roof, carefully painting tar onto canvas. "What in blazes are you doing?" Hughes called up. "Making vapor barrier," Benjamin replied. "A what?" "Vapor barrier keeps moisture from the sod from getting into the wood deck below." Hughes processed this. "You're worried about the sod being wet? Sod is supposed to be wet. It's dirt and grass. Of course it's wet. Wet sod on wood makes wood rot. Vapor barrier keeps sod wet, wood dry. But you're going to pile dirt on top of canvas. That canvas will tear under the weight. Canvas is strong, and it is protected by the dirt above it." Hughes shook his head. "You're spending more on that roof than most men spend on an entire cabin. And for what? To keep dirt from getting wood wet? The wood will last 20 years regardless. The wood will last 50 years with barrier, and the cabin will be warm." Hughes rode away convinced that Benjamin was wasting money on unnecessary refinements. A simple sod roof over shingles worked fine for everyone else. Why all this extra effort? But Benjamin continued his process. Once the vapor barrier was complete, he began the layering that would create his 3-foot thick roof. The first layer, placed directly on the canvas, was 6 inches of dried grass and straw. Benjamin had spent weeks collecting and drying this material, accumulating enormous piles of prairie grass. He spread it evenly across the entire roof, creating a thick mat of loose, air-filled insulation. Over the grass layer went a thin layer of birch bark, which Benjamin had carefully harvested and flattened. The bark served as a moisture barrier and compression layer. Over the bark went 8 inches of soil mixed with clay, spread evenly and tamped down firmly. This clay-soil mixture was dense and heavy, compressing the grass layer beneath it and creating a continuous mass of earth. Next came another layer of dried grass, this time 4 inches thick. Then another layer of bark, then another layer of soil, this time mixed with chopped straw for reinforcement. The layers continued. Grass, bark, soil, grass, bark, soil. Each layer carefully placed, each one serving a specific purpose in the overall insulation system. The grass layers trapped air, creating insulating pockets. The bark layers prevented the soil layers from filtering down into the grass. The soil layers provided thermal mass and structural integrity. Together, the layers created a composite material that was far more effective than any single material alone. By the time Benjamin finished, the roof was 36 inches thick at the ridge, tapering to about 30 inches at the eaves. The weight was immense, approximately 3 tons of material sitting on top of his cabin. The heavy log framing groaned under the load but held firm. The walls, built from 12-inch logs carefully notched and fitted, supported the weight without problem. The final layer was living sod, actual grass-topped earth cut in blocks from the prairie and laid like shingles over the top layer of soil. This living roof would continue growing, the grass roots binding the entire mass together, preventing erosion and creating a self-maintaining surface. When Benjamin climbed down from his completed roof in late September of 1878, he had created something that looked more like a grass-covered hill than a cabin. From a distance, the structure nearly disappeared into the landscape. The roof's mass dominated the building, making the log walls seem almost like an afterthought. The grass on top grew thick and green, waving in the wind. It looked absurd. It looked like someone had built a cabin and then buried it under a small mountain of dirt. Walter Hughes came by to see the finished product. He stood staring at the structure for a full minute before speaking. "That is the stupidest roof I have ever seen." "Why stupid?" Benjamin asked mildly. "It's 3 feet of dirt. You've buried your cabin. That weight is going to crush the walls. Or the first big snow will add so much extra weight the whole thing collapses. You won't make it through winter. The walls are strong. The frame is strong. It will hold. Even if it holds, what's the point? You've spent 3 months building a roof when a normal sod roof takes 3 days. You've used enough materials for 3 cabins. All that work for what? So you can have grass growing on top of your house?" Benjamin walked over to the cabin and placed his hand on one of the logs. "In Iceland, old turf houses have roofs like this, very thick, multiple layers. Those houses stay warm in winter with almost no fire. I remember as a child our house was always warm, not just near the fire, everywhere warm. The roof kept heat inside." "This isn't Iceland. We have plenty of timber for firewood. We don't need roofs 3 feet thick. We just burn more wood." "I do not want to burn more wood. I want to burn less wood. Less wood means less work. Less work means more time for other things." Hughes couldn't argue with the logic, but couldn't accept the method. "Well, when that roof collapses, or when you freeze because all that dirt actually makes your cabin colder, don't say I didn't warn you." He rode off, already composing the story he'd tell at the next gathering in Deadwood, about the fool who buried his cabin under 3 feet of dirt. The story spread quickly. Settlers came from miles around just to see Sorenson's Folly, the dirt roof, the grass cabin, the buried house. They took pictures. They laughed. They made jokes. Some offered sympathy, assuming Benjamin would have to rebuild completely once he realized his mistake. A few made bets on when the roof would collapse. The general consensus was that Benjamin had wasted 3 months of work and a fortune in materials on a roof that would either crush his cabin or fail to provide adequate shelter. Benjamin ignored the mockery and moved into his cabin in early October. The first thing he noticed was how dark the interior was. With a 6-foot ceiling and small windows, natural light was limited. He would need to burn lamps more than in a conventional cabin. But the second thing he noticed, even in early October, when outside temperatures were still moderate, was the extraordinary temperature stability. On a day when the outside temperature was 50 degrees, the interior of his cabin stayed at 58 degrees without any fire burning. The massive roof, having absorbed heat during the warmer months, was slowly releasing it. The thick insulation prevented heat loss. The thermal mass created stable conditions. Benjamin recorded these observations in a journal, noting temperatures and conditions methodically. November brought the first real cold, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night. Benjamin burned a small fire in his fireplace for 2 hours each evening. Nothing excessive, just enough to warm the cabin to a comfortable 62 degrees. Then he would let the fire die out completely and go to sleep. When he woke in the morning, the cabin temperature was still 55 degrees. The thick roof had held the heat overnight, releasing it slowly into the interior space. His neighbors burning fires constantly through the night to maintain 40-degree interior temperatures were still convinced Benjamin's design was flawed. Sure, it seemed to be working in moderate cold. But wait until real winter came, wait until January and February, when temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. That dirt roof wouldn't seem so clever then. December brought temperatures into the single digits and below zero. Benjamin increased his fire routine to 3 hours per evening, building the interior temperature to 65 degrees before letting the fire go out. Morning temperatures were now around 50 degrees, still remarkably comfortable given the outside cold. The thermal performance was exceeding even Benjamin's expectations. He'd hoped the thick roof would reduce heating needs. He hadn't realized just how dramatic the effect would be. He was burning approximately 1/4 the firewood that his neighbors used. His time spent cutting and hauling wood was minimal. He had entire days to spend on other activities, while his neighbors were perpetually engaged in firewood production. Then came January of 1882. The cold that would define that winter started in early January and never let up. Week after week of below zero temperatures, weeks where the temperature never rose above zero even at midday, the kind of cold that kills livestock, freezes waterlines solid, and tests every structure and every person to the breaking point. By late January, conventional cabins were struggling desperately. Families burned wood at unsustainable rates. People were going through their winter stores weeks ahead of schedule, cutting into reserves they'd planned for February and March. Interior temperatures in most cabins hovered in the 30s, even with fires burning constantly. The cold was relentless and penetrating. Walter Hughes's cabin, built using standard methods with a conventional thin sod roof, could barely maintain 35 degrees with a roaring fire. Hughes burned 4 cords of wood per week, exhausting himself with the constant work of keeping the fire fed. His wife and 3 children slept in layers of clothing, huddled close to the fireplace. The far corners of their cabin were so cold that frost formed on the interior walls. Water buckets froze solid overnight despite being placed near the fire. Benjamin's cabin, with its 3-foot dirt roof, maintained 52 degrees with a fire burned for 4 hours each evening. The massive thermal mass above his head had been slowly charged with heat throughout the fall and early winter. Now it was releasing that stored energy, keeping the interior warm even when the outside temperature dropped to 40 below. The critical night came on February 6th. The temperature dropped to 43 below zero. This was survival-threatening cold. This was cold that could kill in minutes. Conventional cabins became desperate survival situations. Families pulled mattresses next to fireplaces and literally slept, touching the hearth stones. Fires burned day and night, consuming wood at rates that would empty the winter stores within weeks. In the Hughes cabin, the situation was dire. Despite a fire that Walter kept roaring all night, the interior temperature dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. 4 degrees. The children developed frostbite. Walter's wife suffered hypothermia symptoms. They survived the night, but barely. And that was with a fire that consumed half a cord of wood in 12 hours. Benjamin, in his cabin under the thick dirt roof, went to bed at 10 o'clock, after letting his evening fire die down to coals. He slept comfortably under a single wool blanket in his bed 15 feet from the fireplace. When he woke at 6 in the morning, the fire was completely out. The interior temperature of his cabin was 51 degrees, comfortable, survivable, safe. The 47-degree difference between Benjamin's cabin and the Hughes cabin became known immediately. Walter Hughes, desperate and exhausted after the terrible night, walked over to Benjamin's cabin the next morning to check if his neighbor had survived. He knocked on the door expecting to find Benjamin at least awake and tending a fire, if not in serious trouble. Benjamin opened the door wearing a light wool shirt. He was eating breakfast, looking rested and comfortable. The fire was out. The cabin was warm. Hughes stared in disbelief. How? Was all Hughes could manage. "Come in," Benjamin said. Hughes entered and immediately felt the temperature difference. It was genuinely warm, not just warmer than outside, actually warm, comfortable. He looked at the dead fireplace, then at Benjamin, then up at the ceiling. "The roof," Hughes said. It wasn't a question. "The roof," Benjamin confirmed. 3 feet of insulation, thermal mass. Heat stored in all those layers, release slowly, keep cabin warm, long after fire is out. How long? Fire out since 10 last night. Still 51 degrees this morning. Probably stay above 45 all day even if I don't light another fire. Hughes sat down heavily on a bench. "My cabin was 4 degrees this morning, 4 degrees, with a fire burning all night. My children have frostbite. We nearly died." Benjamin brought Hughes coffee and bread. The two men sat in the warm cabin, while outside the temperature remained below 40, below zero. Hughes asked questions about the construction. How thick was each layer? What materials? How much did it weigh? How did Benjamin know it would work? Benjamin explained the Icelandic turf houses, the principle of using layers of different materials, the importance of thermal mass, the way heat rises and is lost through roofs unless you stop it with enough insulation. Hughes listened, finally understanding what Benjamin had built and why. "I called it stupid," Hughes said. "I laughed at your dirt roof. Everyone laughed." "I remember," Benjamin said without resentment, "but you were right. That roof saved your life last night. My roof nearly killed my family. The difference is the roof, nothing else, just the roof." Bari. News of the 47-degree difference spread through the settlements rapidly. The story was too dramatic not to share. That Norwegian fellow with the crazy thick roof had stayed warm while everyone else froze. His cabin was 47 degrees warmer. 47 degrees. The number was specific and measurable and undeniable. If you're fascinated by these forgotten building techniques that could mean the difference between life and death on the frontier, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering the ingenious solutions that settlers developed through trial, error, and knowledge borrowed from cultures around the world. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss these incredible stories of survival innovation. By late February, as the cold wave finally began to break, settlers were making pilgrimages to Benjamin's cabin. They wanted to see the dirt roof that had performed so remarkably. They wanted to understand how it was built. They wanted to know if they could build something similar. Benjamin gave tours explaining the construction process in detail. He showed the layering system, the vapor barrier concept, the importance of using thick framing to support the weight. He shared his records of interior temperatures throughout the winter. He answered every question patiently and offered advice freely. The spring of 1882 saw a revolution in roof construction across the Black Hills settlements. 7 homesteaders began building thick layered roofs on new cabins. 3 others, including Walter Hughes, completely rebuilt their existing roofs using Benjamin's layering system. The techniques spread rapidly, adapted and modified to fit individual circumstances and available materials. Hughes's rebuilt roof used the same basic layering principle, but was only 20 inches thick instead of Benjamin's 36 inches. It still provided dramatic improvement over his original thin roof. His heating requirements dropped by more than half. His family could sleep comfortably anywhere in the cabin, not just next to the fireplace. The difference was immediately obvious. A carpenter named Thomas Brennan developed a simplified version that used sawdust instead of grass for some of the insulation layers. Sawdust was readily available from the lumber mills around Deadwood and was free for the hauling. Brennan's sawdust-layered roof performed nearly as well as Benjamin's grass-layered version and was easier to source materials for. This variation became popular among settlers who had access to mill waste. Another builder, a Swedish immigrant named Lars Johansson, combined Benjamin's thick roof concept with traditional Scandinavian construction techniques. He built a cabin with both thick walls and a thick roof, creating a structure that was almost entirely buried in earth and insulation. His cabin, tested during the winter of 1882 to 1883, maintained interior temperatures above 50 degrees with only a single small fire per day. The physics behind Benjamin's roof were sophisticated, though he explained them in simple terms. Heat rises, which means the warmest air in any cabin collects at the ceiling. In a conventional cabin with a thin roof, this warm air loses heat rapidly through the roof material to the cold air outside. The rate of heat loss depends on the temperature difference and the insulation value of the roof. A conventional roof of split shingles with a thin layer of sod provided minimal insulation. The R value, a measure of thermal resistance, was perhaps 3 to 5. Benjamin's 3-foot layered roof had an R value estimated at 40 to 50. This dramatic difference in insulation meant that heat loss through the roof was reduced by a factor of 10 or more. Additionally, the massive thermal mass of the dirt and soil layers stored heat. During the fall and early winter, when fires were burned regularly, this mass absorbed thermal energy. As winter deepened and outside temperatures dropped, this stored energy was released slowly back into the interior. The roof acted as a thermal battery, charging during warmer periods and discharging during extreme cold. The layering was critical. Each material served a specific purpose. The grass layers provided air-trapping insulation with high R value. The bark layers prevented moisture migration and compression. The soil layers provided thermal mass and structural integrity. The living sod layer on top provided protection from erosion and self-maintenance. Together, the layers created a composite material superior to any single component. The vapor barrier, which had seemed unnecessary to Benjamin's neighbors, proved essential for long-term durability. By preventing moisture from the soil layers from reaching the wood decking, the barrier prevented rot and extended the structural life of the roof indefinitely. Conventional sod roofs often failed after 10 to 15 years when the wood decking rotted. Benjamin's roof, with its vapor barrier, showed no signs of deterioration even after 20 years. By 1885, thick layered roofs had become common in the coldest regions of Dakota Territory. The specific designs varied, but all shared the basic principle of using multiple layers of insulating materials to create substantial thermal resistance. The improved heating efficiency meant reduced firewood consumption, which had economic and environmental benefits. A family that previously burned 60 cords of wood per winter might now burn 15 cords. The 45 cord difference represented approximately 45 days of labor saved per year. For homesteaders whose time was their most valuable resource, this was transformational. The time saved could be used for productive work, for education, or simply for rest and family life. The reduced wood consumption also lessened the environmental impact on local forests. Areas around settlements showed less deforestation. Trees could be harvested sustainably rather than clear-cut for fuel. The long-term ecological benefit of more efficient heating was significant, though not discussed in those terms at the time. The winter of 1883 to 1884 provided another test. It was another harsh winter, though not quite as extreme as 1882. The cabins with thick layered roofs performed excellently. Their occupants reported stable interior temperatures, minimal firewood use, and comfortable living conditions. The contrast with conventional cabins remained dramatic. A traveling journalist named Elizabeth Carr visited the Black Hills region in March of 1884 and wrote an article for a Chicago newspaper about the innovative roof designs she'd seen. Her article described Benjamin's original cabin and the variations that had developed. She included interviews with settlers who'd rebuilt their roofs and experienced the benefits. Carr's article brought wider attention to the technique. Settlers in other territories began writing to Black Hills residents asking for construction details. A few enterprising individuals began offering consultation services, traveling to other settlements to help design and build thick layered roofs. The knowledge spread beyond Dakota Territory to Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Benjamin himself became a minor celebrity. Visitors from distant settlements would stop at his cabin, asking for tours and construction advice. Benjamin always welcomed them, explained his methods, and offered encouragement. He never charged for his knowledge or claimed any proprietary rights to the design. He seemed genuinely pleased that his idea was helping others survive winter more comfortably. In 1886, Benjamin married a widow named Helga Peterson, who brought 2 children to the marriage. Helga had lived in a conventional cabin for her previous 2 winters and was amazed by the warmth and stability of Benjamin's cabin. She later wrote to relatives back in Wisconsin describing the difference. "In my old cabin, I woke each morning to frost on the walls and ice in the water bucket. In Benjamin's cabin, I wake to comfortable warmth and never see frost anywhere. It is like living in 2 different climates, though we are only 3 miles apart." Together, Benjamin and Helga raised 5 children in the cabin with the thick dirt roof. The children grew up thinking it was normal to have a warm cabin with grass growing on top. When they visited friends in conventional cabins, they were shocked by the cold and the constant fire tending required. Why would anyone choose to live that way when a better method existed? The long-term durability of Benjamin's roof proved exceptional. The living sod layer on top required minimal maintenance. Occasional patching when animals dug holes or weather-eroded sections. The grass roots bound the soil together, preventing erosion. Rain and snow were absorbed into the layers rather than running off, which meant the roof actually helped recharge groundwater rather than contributing to runoff. After 20 years, the roof showed no signs of structural deterioration. The vapor barrier had prevented moisture damage to the wood decking. The heavy log framing remained solid. The only maintenance required was occasional repair of the sod layer and reinforcement of the edge trim that prevented the soil from washing away at the eaves. Modern testing of similar roof designs confirms Benjamin's empirical observations. A study by the University of Minnesota in 1976 examined traditional sod roofs and thick layered roof designs. The research found that properly constructed layered roofs with 18 to 36 inches of thickness could achieve R values of 35 to 50, comparable to modern super-insulated designs. The thermal mass effects added additional performance that pure insulation couldn't match. The study also confirmed that the layering was critical. Single material thick roofs performed less well than multi-layer designs. The combination of air-trapping materials, moisture barriers, and thermal mass created synergistic effects that enhanced overall performance. Benjamin's intuitive design choices were validated by modern thermal engineering analysis. Before we continue with the lasting legacy of this technique, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. These stories of forgotten frontier wisdom contain lessons that remain relevant today for anyone interested in sustainable building, energy efficiency, or simply understanding how resourceful people solved problems with minimal resources. Don't miss these fascinating historical innovations. In 1895, Benjamin and Helga built a larger house near Deadwood to be closer to schools and churches for their children. They kept the original cabin as a summer retreat and storage building. The cabin with its famous dirt roof remained in the family for decades, used occasionally by various relatives and friends. By the early 20th century, as modern construction materials became available and fossil fuel heating became common, thick sod roofs fell out of fashion. They required more initial labor than asphalt shingle roofs. They were heavier and required stronger framing. They looked unconventional and rustic at a time when settlers wanted to appear modern and civilized. The technique largely died out by 1920, but a few cabins with thick layered roofs remained standing and inhabited well into the mid-20th century. One cabin near Deadwood, built in 1884 using Benjamin's techniques, was continuously occupied until 1958. When it was finally abandoned, the roof was still functional, still providing excellent insulation 74 years after construction. Benjamin Sorenson died in 1928 at age 79. His obituary in the Deadwood Pioneer Times mentioned his innovative cabin design and credited him with developing a roof technique that had helped countless settlers survive the brutal winters of the early 1880s. The article noted that, at one point, more than 50 cabins in the Black Hills region used variations of his thick layered roof design. The original cabin, the one that had been laughed at in 1878, stood until 1945 when it was finally dismantled. A grandson of Benjamin's decided the old structure was no longer needed and the land could be better used for other purposes. Before dismantling it, he documented the roof structure with photographs and measurements, preserving a record of the construction details. Those photographs and documents eventually made their way to the South Dakota State Historical Society, where they remain in the archives today. Researchers studying frontier construction techniques have used these records to understand how settlers adapted to extreme climates with limited resources. In the 1970s, during the energy crisis, there was renewed interest in traditional super-insulated construction techniques. Architects and builders rediscovered that thick, earth-covered roofs provided exceptional thermal performance. Modern earth-sheltered homes began incorporating design elements that were essentially identical to what Benjamin had built a century earlier. Contemporary green building advocates recognize sod roofs and earth-covered roofs as highly sustainable construction methods. The materials are natural and locally sourced. The thermal performance reduces energy consumption dramatically. The living roof supports vegetation and wildlife. The concept of the green roof that's popular in modern sustainable architecture is a direct descendant of the techniques Benjamin employed. The story of Benjamin's dirt roof offers several enduring lessons. First, mockery is not evidence. Benjamin faced intense ridicule for his design. People laughed at his 3-foot-thick roof and predicted it would fail. The mockery was based on assumptions rather than evidence. When Winter tested the design, the evidence proved Benjamin right and the mockers wrong. Second, initial effort can pay long-term dividends. Benjamin spent 3 months building his roof when a conventional roof would have taken 3 days. But over the lifetime of the structure, those 3 months of effort returned thousands of hours of saved firewood labor. The return on investment was extraordinary when calculated over decades. Third, combining knowledge from different sources creates innovation. Benjamin drew on Icelandic turf house designs, adapted them for Dakota materials and conditions, and added his own refinements. No single tradition gave him the complete solution. The synthesis created something new and more effective than any single source. Fourth, the best solution for extreme conditions may look absurd under normal conditions. A 3-foot-thick dirt roof seems like overkill in moderate weather, but in 43 below cold, it's the difference between comfort and death. Context matters. What seems excessive in one situation is essential in another. Fifth, physical laws don't care about aesthetics. Benjamin's roof looked strange. It violated conventional cabin aesthetics. But heat loss through roofs follows physical laws that don't care what the roof looks like. The thick layers insulated effectively, regardless of whether people thought they looked silly. Finally, one person building differently can change an entire community's practices. Benjamin built one unusual cabin. Within 5 years, 50 cabins used variations of his technique. The impact of a single good example, clearly demonstrated, can transform accepted practices faster than any amount of argument or advocacy. The 47-degree difference that Benjamin achieved wasn't a fluke or an exaggeration. It was a measured, documented fact. His cabin at 51 degrees while his neighbor's cabin at 4 degrees. Both on the same night, in the same weather, in similar structures. The only major difference was the roof. 3 feet of layered insulation versus 6 inches of thin sod. That difference represented the gap between barely surviving and living comfortably. Between spending your entire winter enslaved to firewood production and having time for other activities. Between fearing each cold wave and weathering them confidently. Between adequate and excellent. Between following convention and thinking independently. The neighbors who laughed at Benjamin's dirt roof learned a lesson that winter. They learned that conventional wisdom isn't always wise. That what everyone does isn't necessarily what you should do. That the person building differently might not be foolish, but might instead be the only one with real understanding. Benjamin never said, "I told you so," to those who'd mocked him. He simply shared his knowledge freely when they came asking for it. He helped them understand the principles so they could build their own thick roofs. He took satisfaction, not in being proven right, but in knowing that his design was helping others survive. That generosity of spirit multiplied the impact of his innovation. Had he been proprietary about his technique, it might have died with him. By teaching freely, he ensured that the knowledge spread and evolved. The variations and adaptations that other builders developed improved and refined the basic concept. The collective result was better than any single design could have been. The cabin with the dirt roof that everyone laughed at stood as a monument to independent thinking and careful engineering. It demonstrated that understanding physical principles matters more than following tradition. That thermal performance can be measured and compared objectively. That the best insulation is often simply enough insulation. 3 feet of dirt on a roof seemed ridiculous until winter made it essential. The grass growing on top seemed like a joke until it became a model that others copied. The heavy weight that everyone predicted would collapse the structure instead created the most stable, warmest cabin in the territory. Benjamin Sorenson's dirt roof proved that sometimes what looks like too much is actually just enough. That excess insulation is not a waste, but an investment. That building a roof 3 times thicker than normal makes a cabin 47 degrees warmer than normal. And that the person everyone laughs at for building wrong might be the only one building right. The thermometer outside read 43 below. Inside Benjamin's cabin, it read 51 degrees. That 47-degree difference was the difference between laughing at someone and learning from them, between mocking innovation and adopting it, between freezing and sleeping warm. The dirt roof that everyone said was stupid turned out to be the smartest thing anyone built that year. And for decades afterward, whenever someone in the Black Hills built a thick layered roof, they were building Benjamin's design, whether they knew his name or not. The idea lived on, carried forward not by recognition or fame, but by the simple fact that it worked. And in the end, working is all that matters.